In the Grundrisse, Marx referred explicitly to this conception of human wealth, to a rich human being as rich as possible in needs because rich in qualities and relations. Real wealth, Marx understood, is the development of human capacity, quote, the development of the rich individuality which is as all-sided in its production as in its consumption. Indeed, he continued, what is wealth other than the universality of individual needs, capacities, pleasures, productive forces, etc.? In short, Marx looked to a society where each individual is able to develop his full potential, to the, quote, absolute working out of his creative potentialities, the complete working out of the human content, the development of all human powers as such, the end in itself. Could anything be clearer in terms of Marx's perspective? That is what socialism, his conception of socialism, was all about. The creation of a society which removes all obstacles to the development of human beings. But how are rich human beings created? How are they produced? Again, Marx was always clear on this. He was clear that people develop through their own activity. That was his concept of revolutionary practice, the coincidence of the changing of circumstances and human activity or self-change. In other words, people do not develop by giving them gifts from above. That was the essence of the utopian socialism that Marx rejected. The belief that if we change circumstances for people, for example, give them new structures, new communities, and the like, and then insert people in them, then they'll be themselves different people. And in contrast, Marx's concept of revolutionary practice is the red thread which runs throughout his work. He talked, for example, of how people develop through their struggles, how this is the only way the working class can succeed in ridding itself of the muck of ages and become fitted to create society anew. And he told workers they would have to go through as many as 50 years of struggle, well, not only to bring about a change in society, but also to change yourselves and prepare yourselves for the exercise of political power. End of quote. In other words, it's always the same point. We change ourselves through our activity. And this is true of all activities of people. Every process of activity has two products: the change in circumstances and the change in the actor. And every labor process creates a joint product, a particular human product. As Marx commented in the Grundrisse, in production, the producers change too, in that they bring out new qualities in themselves, develop themselves in production, transform themselves, develop new powers and ideas, new needs, and new language. End of quote. And here indeed is the concept of the cooperative society based on common ownership of the means of production. When Marx would say in capital, well, when the worker cooperates in a planned way with others, he strips off the fetters of his individuality and develops the capabilities of his species. End of quote. But what about productive human activity under capitalist relations of production? What is the joint product that develops alongside the commodities containing surplus value that emerge from this particular labor process? How are the capacities of producers shaped by the social relations characteristic of capitalism? Well, Marx is clear. Within capitalist relations of production, people are subjected to, quote, the powerful will of a being outside them who subjects their activity to his purpose. The creative power of the worker's labor establishes itself as the power of capital, as an alien power confronting him. So fixed capital, machinery, technology, quote, all the general productive forces of the social brain appear as attributes of capital and as independent of workers. In other words, Marx's story is how workers produce products which are the products of capital, the property of capital, which are then turned against them and dominate them as capital. The world of wealth, Marx commented, faces the worker as an alien world dominating him. And that alien world dominates the worker more and more because capital constantly generates new needs to consume as the result of its requirement to realize surplus value contained in commodities. For workers, producing within this relationship is what he called a process of complete emptying out, a total alienation, the sacrifice of the human end in itself to an entirely external end. That's from the Grundrisse. How else but with money, the true need that capitalism creates, can we fill that vacuum? We fill the vacuum of our lives with things. We are driven to consume. But consumerism is only one way in which capitalism deforms people. In Marx's Capital, he described the mutilation, the impoverishment, the crippling of body and mind of the worker bound hand and foot for life to a single specialized operation that occurs in the division of labor characteristic of manufacturing. So, did the development of machinery liberate workers from this single process? Certainly the potential was there for workers to develop their capabilities. However, you can detect the horror with which Marx explains how machinery provided a technical basis for the capitalist inversion, how it completed the separation of the intellectual faculties of the production process from manual labor. In this situation, he said, head and hand become separate and hostile. Every atom of freedom, both in bodily and intellectual activity, is lost. This is all from capital. All means for development of production undergo a dialectical inversion. They degrade, they distort the worker into a fragment of a man, they degrade him and alienate him from the intellectual potentialities of the labor process. In short, in addition to producing commodities and capital itself, the joint product of capitalist production that Marx identified in his work Capital is the fragmented, crippled human being whose enjoyment consists in possessing and consuming things. A poor human being. Once we understand Marx's consistent focus upon human development, it's clear that the very premise from which he wrote Capital is the concept of a society in which the development of all human powers is an end in itself. That society of free individuality based on universal development of individuals and the subordination of their communal social producty as their social wealth. That is the specter that haunts Marx's Capital. And can we doubt at all the presence of that other world from Capital's opening sentence? You start to read Capital, you're immediately introduced there to the horror of a society in which wealth appears not as real human wealth, but rather as an immense collection of commodities. Imagine Marx's perspective is real wealth is human development, and here is a society in which wealth appears as a collection of commodities. That's the horror that Marx is describing here. In other words, what we can see furthermore in Capital is that in contrast in his work Capital to the society propelled by the capitalist impulse to expand the value of this capital and which looks upon human beings as nature as mere means to this goal of capital's growth, Marx explicitly evoked in Capital what he called, quote, the inverse situation in which objective wealth is there to satisfy the worker's own need for development. The worker's own need for development? Where did this come from? I mean, this is a logical work step by step. Where do we suddenly have a discussion of the inverse situation in which wealth, objective wealth, is there to satisfy the worker's own need for development? In fact, that inverse situation is oriented toward human development, is the perspective from which Marx persistently critiques capitalism. After all, he describes the fact that in capitalism, means of production employ workers as, quote, this inversion, indeed this distortion, which is peculiar to and characteristic of capitalist production. End of quote. So here's an exercise. Take every place that Marx talks about the capitalist inversion and invert those. Then you get an idea of the society that Marx wants to see. In other words, read Capital with the purpose of identifying the inversions and the distortions in capitalism, those distortions that produce crippled, truncated human beings, and we get a sense of the alternative society necessary to produce rich human beings. We understand what is peculiar and characteristic of production in Marx's conception of socialism by inverting the capitalist inversion, by negating the negation. Given Marx's description of the crippling of the body and mind of the worker, of how all means for the development of capitalist production will undergo a dialectical inversion and alienate from the worker the intellectual potentialities of the labor process, it's no accident that Marx in Capital can say, the revolutionary ferments whose goal is the abolition of the old division of labor stand in diametrical contradiction with the capitalist form of production. End quote.